Quit that. All right. Welcome to another security seminar. This is CS 590E. Today our guest speaker is David Auksmith. He is Chief Technologist for Data and Communication Security Technology at Intel Corporation. He will talk to us today about the impact of technology on law enforcement and national security, and the title of his talk is Balancing Big Brother. David?
Yeah, thank you. I chose the title, it's partially a pun. I don't know if you're familiar with the book. There's an excellent book called Building in Big Brother, which is from Lance Hoffman at George Washington University, or Georgetown, one or the other, but at any rate. And it is a description of the attempts over the last couple of years for law enforcement in particular to get, if you will, backdoors built into products. And so what this talk is about is looking at things a little bit differently. Most of the talks I'm sure that you get here are mostly technology-centric. This is not a technology talk by and large. This is a talk about policy. It's sort of the other side of the world, though I'll address some of the technology as we go through. One thing I do want to point out, a couple of things. First is my email address is on there. If you have questions after this, please feel free just to email me. The other is the little bit of Latin, which I hope shows up on the small monitors reasonably well, but it's Quis custodia ipsa custodiis, which basically translates into who guards the guards, which is the central problem in computer security. The other thing which I'd like to do about this talk is I have my own particular set of ground rules. Primarily among those is I expect you guys to ask questions as we go along, to kibitz, yell, distract, whatever you want, because that will make it more interesting for everybody. I will get bored and you will get bored if you don't talk. So I would prefer for this to be very interactive. Happy to answer questions at the end, but let's do them as we go along also. So the agenda, I'm going to cover a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to do is look a little bit like marketing slides, and I apologize, but I need to set the stage for that, and that is how we see, from Intel's perspective and also from the industry, what we see as a PC environment. Why is all of this important? What are the factors that are, if you will, driving what I'll call the next section, the threat? Why do people want to attack systems? And then I'll talk about the government. And in the government perspective, I will talk primarily in terms of law enforcement and the national security infrastructure of this country, but with some talks also for other countries, and how the issues about the PC environment and the threat collide with the interests of law enforcement. And then I'll finish up with two things. One is a set of slides that look at the technological trends that we see going forward and how they will have an impact on nations' ability to either defend themselves from bad guys in the law enforcement context, or to derive intelligence in the national security context. Last, I'll finish with some conclusions I think that are reasonable to draw from all of the previous work, and some possible ways of going back to balancing in the needs for Big Brother. What I would hope to get into a discussion with slightly as we go through is why is there any needs for Big Brother to begin with, and I'll hope to address some of that too. So the first thing, the PC environment. There's a phrase that our former CEO, Andy Grove, used to always use. Basically says, we are moving towards a world of approximately 1 billion connected computers. That has amazing implications for society as a whole. That means, among other things, that there is information lying around from 1 billion different sources at your disposal, if you will. One of the ways that we always like to think of it in the security context is we're moving towards approximately 1 billion different people who can attack my computer, or another way of putting it, moving towards a world of 1 billion computers and about 1 billion different security policies sort of simultaneously. What we would like to foster at Intel and in the industry is a slightly different notion. We would like to say we're moving towards a world of 1 billion trusted connected computers. So a lot of the goals and projects that you see going on within the industry are aimed towards that end. Just some basic data on PC forecasting, but you can roughly see that worldwide PC forecast sometime next year around 130 million in sales. Connected PCs on the World Wide Web exceed about somewhere around 350 million. This is actually, the slide is actually wrong. We ramped up a little higher than that as we find out. Internet usage by percentage of population is sort of interesting because it's not necessarily the most high-tech countries that are in this. The point of this slide is that, yeah, the US is about 40%, but that the whole rest of the world is picking up pretty rapidly. You will find if you go to a country like Malaysia, this basically says that 1 out of every 3 people you meet is likely to be using the internet. So it is truly a global phenomenon. The other thing is that consumer email. Email is up around 300 million messages per day in the United States alone. That is increasing very rapidly also. If you look at the growth of paper mail, you can predict a time when email will eclipse paper mail, and it's not until about 2012 at current growth rates, which is also, again, a fairly interesting thing. It means that we have fundamentally changed the way that we conduct our lives. Everything that we used to do in paper is now moving to an electronic form. A couple of just odd facts. TV was available for 13 years before 50 million people tuned in. It took the internet only 4 years to do that. The rapidity of the growth is fairly million. AOL, sometime last year, when this particular statistic came out, in 3 months alone had increased its users by 1 million. So the number of people getting online is very rapidly increasing. Right now, about 43% of U.S. households have a PC, and 1/2 of those have internet access. The interesting thing, out of those that have internet access, spend approximately 7 hours a week online. If you look at adults in households, they don't spend much more than that watching television. So we are having an impact, I hope, positively. Yahoo receives about 95 million page views per day. And that was up, this was a Q1 98 statistic, that was up 46% in 1 quarter. This is perhaps the most interesting. This will lead into where we're going. This is a quote from the Commerce Department's report at the beginning of this year. Without information technology and the electronic commerce that it fosters, overall inflation would have hit 3.1% last year, more than a full percentage point higher than the 2% basically that it logged in. That means that electronic commerce, which is sort of not quite here yet, is here enough to account for 1 full percentage point of anti-inflationary growth, if you will. In other words, it allowed businesses to offset 1 percentage point of inflationary tendency by being more efficient, by reducing their cost of operation. Other statistics that I've heard is, here's a couple from Intel. We, as a company, would like to embrace the web and electronic commerce as all companies did. And in the last quarter of 1998, we finally went on the web for selling our products to both wholesale and retail through what would be considered currently electronic commerce channels. We did $3 billion worth of business in 1 quarter. The first quarter it was up and running. The U.S. Defense Department alone spends about $800 million a day in electronic commerce, primarily on petroleum oil and lubricants, but they spend about $800 million a day. So electronic commerce is real. The big growth is expected to be precisely in that segment. Right now, we're looking at about $10 to $12 billion worth of business done electronically. By the year 2002, it had been forecasted to be about $327 billion. This is business to business and business to consumer. We expect that to be considerably low. We are now looking in our own estimates of being closer to $400 billion. So there's this huge ramp. If you'll notice from this, the important part is that the majority of the growth in electronic commerce is business to business. It is not business to consumer, which stands to reason since businesses spend most of their money with businesses. Well, what does all this have to do with anything? Well, it basically means this. If we're going to go to a place where we do everything online, Among the things that we're going to do online is crime. And what you're seeing is a more sophisticated criminal activity move to online, which had been done in the paper and physical world. And you're also seeing, though it's been happening for quite some time, those things of interest to national security communities also shifting and focusing primarily on online activities. This stands to reason. So what I'd like to do now is, given that scenario, if you will, what we've set up is there's a lot of money out there on the web. There's a lot of property. There's a lot of knowledge. That brings in, there's something to steal in essence. So what exactly is the threat? Now, I'll do a couple of just real quick statistics on crimes. You guys have seen them. It's not really particularly important. If you can't read them on your small screens, the very large bar up there is for viruses, and we've seen that coming. But actually, believe it or not, percentage-wise, in terms of attacks, viruses are dropping. It's becoming less of a problem than it previously has been. The more other are insider abuse of net access, basically, though insider attacks of your own systems, and that is indeed growing. The interesting thing is, these are from the FBI computer crime surveys of 1998, but basically said, how much does computer crime cost? How much are they leaving with, if you will? And the top bar is unauthorized access by insiders. So what are insiders stealing? And the dollar figure attached to that is about $2.8 billion in 1 year. Yeah, please.
Is that the cost of dealing with this, or is that how much money the insiders are taking home and putting in their bank accounts?
It's a bit of both. The wonderful thing about the FBI statistics is that they have merged a lot of categories. So this is a raw figure. So what that means is that's the cost of recovering, of tracking down, and of theft, actuality. So it's a little hard to tell. But what it does tell you is somebody had to pay about $2.8 billion to recover from whatever that crime was, and however they did it. And typically speaking, in insiders, it's very frequently actually money that leaves the door. Outsiders, generally, it's recovery time, but insiders, a couple of spectacular ones ended up on this particular thing, which was a SWIFT theft, which is the Interbank Clearinghouse, lost a huge amount of money from an insider deal that happened there, and I'm sure that inflated this particular bar a great deal. But the point is, someone did attack SWIFT. Yes, it was insiders, but it was a $500 million deal. And that can attract attention. Who is the bad guy? I skipped over one. That's okay. Who is the bad guy? Basically, from all the statistics tell you, it's the guy on the inside. It's actually someone you trust, misusing that trust. The interesting thing about that particular statistic is that, by and large, it means that all firewalls in the world won't do you any good, because the person who is likely to rip you off is the person you gave access to in the first place. So that says that conventional security technology probably isn't the best suited to deal with what actually is occurring in terms of dollar amount of crime going on. The other thing about who is the bad guy is, where do they come from? Well, the surprising, or not so surprising, about 85% of the time it's amateurs. It's people who would not be considered criminals. They are crimes of opportunity. It goes up from 9% to semi-professional and 5% to professional. These are FBI numbers. I have no idea what the difference between a professional and a semi-professional is. I assume it's an apprentice crook. I don't know. The very top, though, is interesting, and that's 1% organized crime. But this is a somewhat older statistic, and that is the, if you will, the fastest growing collection of crime is actually organized crime moving in electronically. There's a quote at the bottom which I really like, and it's a quote from William Webster when he was the director of the FBI. It says basically, we have a free society in this country because most criminals are stupid. Now, the interesting thing is that criminals are getting a lot less stupid, as it turns out. Maybe they're not, or the technology is getting more understandable. I'm not sure. But what would have been a barrier to crime previously is becoming less so in terms of technology uses. A good example is what the Treasury Department calls casual counterfeiting. One of the biggest problems that currency controllers have in industrialized nations is the person who goes home and, using a scanner and printer, produces a wad of 20s over the weekend and passes them. And there is a considerable amount of that going on, and it's remarkably easy to do. So that would be sort of, who are those people? Are they amateurs? Yeah, so it's an amateur entrance into what used to be a fairly sophisticated crime. Now, all of the statistics aside, I'm going to walk you through a model that we use to look at who the bad guys are. And one way to look at who the bad guys are and what the source of attack is what security perimeter do they have to attack to be successful? So the first thing you want to look at is you basically can draw a security perimeter around the machine. That says the bad guys coming in over the net. That's your typical, if you will, hacker over the network. In order to do that, they have found a weakness or violated the security policy of essentially the network protocols and whatever else you put up in front of your network. And this is a standard way. Typically, this is spoofing, it's denial of service attacks, replay attacks, all sorts of other types of sort of traditional ways to get into a machine. But what I would like to say is this, interestingly enough, as it's been built, is not the one that you generally worry about in terms of real true crime, because most crime comes from insiders, not outsiders, so this is sort of irrelevant. A more interesting one has to do with the next level, which is assuming someone has gotten access or has put a piece of software onto a machine, call it malicious code, however they got that in is irrelevant. One way to look at this is viruses, Trojan horses, worms, etc., but it also could be changes in code such that it violates the security system in some way or does something that it's not supposed to do. And the boundary that's being violated here is they managed to get it on, but what they're basically doing is they're exploiting the operating system boundaries. In other words, they still have to respect the operating system and how it uses resources, but for one reason or another they have found a way to violate the security policy of the operating system. It could be that the operating system didn't have a security policy, which is somewhat true with many of them, but at any rate, that's basically where it sits. Now, this is probably a good look at what most insider crime looks like, and that then infers that there's a whole different set of things that one needs to do to defend against this. What we're really talking about here are things like trusted operating system, audit records, distributed intrusion detection, that sort of thing. But it actually misses a rather interesting and large section. There is a set of crime that occurs when the user is actually, the person legitimately holding the PC is likely to be your adversary. And this happens with basically electronic ownership rights problems. For example, when the bits have value, whether it's intellectual property protection, whether that intellectual property is a song that comes down, or making a copy of a movie, or making a copy of a book, or in some cases making a copy of a program, or even making a copy of money, going back to the Treasury example. And in this case, we have a rather interesting problem. What is the security perimeter that you would expect to erect to stop someone from doing this? Well, the only thing you've got, basically, since the person has access to the machine and may even attempt to put a logic analyzer on it, the only thing you can do, basically, is build it into hardware. You have to produce a barrier such that the cost of bridging that barrier is prohibitive for the average user, which is why Intel's getting involved in this. Here's an interesting way to look at threat. First of all, there's a general statement that says threat follows value. The more money there is out there, the more likely it is to get stolen. Well, one way to look at bad guys is if we look at the x-axis of this graph, is that the x-axis here is sort of increasing sophistication and resources that a bad guy might bring to bear. So down at the bottom, you basically have the average person having average software resources. And as you move up, you get sort of a knowledgeable engineer with reasonable software resources up to an expert, someone who truly understands the system, understands all the protocols, using very professional software resources, soft ice, other very fancy debuggers, etc. come to mind. And then as you keep going up, you get expert with hardware resources, whether those are logic analyzers or processor emulators or things along those lines. And at the very top, You have experts with unlimited resources. These are people who can spend unlimited amounts of time and money to attack your system. These people do exist. They're called governments. In some cases, they are the person that you're trying to defend against. Whether they're your government, that's up to you, or there's some other government counterfeiting money or making a movie or whatever that might be. If you just use this graph to look at things in that way, it really wouldn't answer, or it wouldn't give you much information, let's put it that way. So another aspect to add to this is if you look at the, I said x-axis later, but I meant y beginning, sorry. The x-axis along the bottom. What you have there is, so if someone breaks the system, what is the result of that break? What is your exposure? The worst case scenario is that if someone breaks a security feature, they can post something on the net that can simply be downloaded and your whole system goes crash. Let's use the example of a DVD movie because that's at least understandable. So what we're talking about here is it may have taken someone a logic analyzer to break the DVD player, but once they've done that, they can now post a piece of software on the net that you load onto your computer and the DVD system is now cracked and you can copy any movie or watch any movie you want to. That's the worst case scenario. That's maximum exposure. You can go further to the right to get less and less exposure to include, well, even if someone broke this, the best that they're going to be able to do is if you break this and if you download this patch, you can watch The Lion King, one DVD movie. Not the entire system, but it breaks some part of the system. All the way to the right is, I've been looking at this and here's some clues and this is the best I can do kind of thing. Now there's a couple of lessons that come out of this. The first is that there probably is a curve somewhere in there, an area that's covered that is economically feasible to protect. And here's basically it says, there is nothing on earth I can do to actually protect a PC, a chip, piece of software from someone who has infinite resources and time. I'm sorry, I just can't. Governments can't do that. It happens. So I probably, as a commercial vendor, aren't going to build anything that actually tries to do that because that would be ludicrous. However, it might be worthwhile to pay me to build something that someone has to use a logic analyzer, right, to break, that they can't just use a software tool. However, if they can then post something on the net that kills it off, then only one person with one logic analyzer is needed to break the whole thing, not everybody having a logic analyzer. So there's a curve in there somewhere that says, well, if it takes a logic analyzer to break it, I still don't want it to be an exposure where all you have to do is one person post it on the net. So there's some area in there which is economically feasible to protect in terms of exposure and in terms of the cost. Now you can argue about exactly where that curve goes, but the notion of that curve there is, I think, a pretty decent one. But the interesting thing that comes out of this slide is not the curve or any of that, but is how you move the curve. And I can move it up the y-axis. I can move it, make it harder to attack. I can move that curve up by moving things from software to hardware. The more I move them into silicon, the more it costs you to attack it. It's very simple. The more sophisticated you have to be. What's a little less obvious is I can move it along the x-axis also by making each installation or each instance unique. To the extent that I create a uniqueness in what I put on a machine, how good that uniqueness is means that it can no longer be broken as a Bohr break once, run everywhere attack. It means that each individual instance will have to be broken. So those are actually the things that are probably more important to take away, is that you can push things into hardware, but even if you can't, you should be able to make things more unique. There are a number of interesting tools that have been developed to create uniquenesses on installation and things of that sort, and those all go towards being able to defend the machine from threats. So there's an area that's feasible to protect with software. Again, you could argue whatever the shape of that is. But the interesting thing is, from our perspective, of course, is that hardware gives you a much larger area that you can defend against, because you've moved things up into hardware, and we actually can make each piece of hardware unique if we want to. I mean, it's more difficult in the manufacturing process, but we can do it. This is another way of looking at that same model. On the left, going up the y-axis again is the cost of the tools involved and what roughly they are and the difficulty of administering them. And you go from simple Microsoft C++ and compiler, for example, soft dice, to simulators, to probe modules, to logic analyzers, and at the very top, costing over $100,000 ion beam equipment. And what you can do is look at what each of these, because of the things they're defending against, what do they actually allow you to defend against. And so if you look at someone who comes and attacks over the wire, pretty much if you can move the technology up to where it requires at least a simulator, then you may very well be able to defend against that. There are ways of doing that using hardware-assisted, tamper-resistant software, other types of modules, obfuscation technologies. If you move above that and require any level of hardware whatsoever, whether that's a probe module or a logic analyzer, then you can defend against malicious code and software attacks. And at the very end, if you really want to defend against a user, then you have to get to some fairly sophisticated technology. And if you look at the types of things that you're trying to do along those, network authentication is sort of down at the very bottom. That's an attack over the wire. A secure transaction in terms of electronic commerce is essentially the same as a software attack. You need to subvert that transaction. And if you're looking at delivering content, you actually have to look at the user having access to the machine. Now, that set up, if you will, how we see bad guys. So now, what about the government? Why did they get involved in this in the first place? And this will be most of the talk. I call it the balancing act, which is kind of interesting. And I'll go back to cryptography because that's what most of the discussion's been about. But I want to give you some aspects of the government's point of view. The first one that cannot be ignored is that cryptography, or more precisely cryptanalysis, has won wars. It is not to be taken lightly. There is a huge advantage to be gained by people who do it well. And if you look at the reaction of governments to how they dealt with cryptography, it is directly related to their success during the Second World War in cryptanalysis. The US was the hardest to deal with. They had the most success. The British were the next, French, etc. It's directly related to how successful they've been in the past. From an FBI perspective, cryptography enables coordinated international crime. That bothers them an awful lot. Right now, one of the nice things about bad guys is that they're really bad organizers by and large, and they have a hard time coordinating their efforts. And most of the attacks, from a law enforcement perspective, against organized crime or terrorist organizations, pedophiles, any number of those things, is actually based on being able to track the communications between those individuals. This is important also. It is important to step back and realize that this is not an idle question that you're pondering here. It is really about the safety of your society. On the other hand, cryptography is the only technology we've got for enforcing trust on the web and for doing all the other things that we just led up for that billion connected computers, for the web usage, for the electronic commerce, all the things that I did in the first section. Cryptography is the only technology that can be brought to bear to solve many of those problems. So now this is the balancing act. How do we balance this between the needs of government, who would like to have strong cryptography in their country and weak everywhere else, to law enforcement, who doesn't want it at all, or they would like for them to use it but certainly not average citizens, and the average citizen who absolutely needs cryptography for privacy and for security of electronic transactions. There's a couple of interesting things that come out of this. If you don't think this applies to you, I submit that in the future, every single company is basically an internet company. There's no such thing as a non-internet company anymore. This is going to apply to every company. It's going to apply to every individual. If you don't think this is true, I'll give you a piece of anecdotal information. I have a cable modem at home, so plug this in and I run a network at home. Being who I am and the sort of business I'm in, I put up a firewall and did all the other things. And in the first week it was up, I had 3 probe attacks run against it, which I thought was very interesting. I mean, nobody knew it was particularly me. It was an address picked out at random. But as more and more homes and average people become, if you will, we like to think of the connected PC, the permanently connected PC. Well, I see permanently attackable PC, so this applies to you too. The interesting thing about those probe attacks, by the way, is I traced them all back and lost all 3 of them at Chinese Telecom. So let's talk about the cast of players that weigh in on this. And this is yet another 3-letter acronym list. From law enforcement, the main people are the FBI, but there's a whole bunch of other 3-letter acronyms, except for the Secret Service. I don't know why they don't have a 3-letter acronym, but that sort of weigh into this discussion. The principal thing that's been happening has been led by the Justice Department, primarily through the Attorney General, Janet Reno, and through the FBI Director, Louis Freeh. And the basic stance there is that there are lots of bad things that would happen if there was a free reign of cryptography and people could keep all communications secret. They will give you the contention that it is totally lawful for them to be able to intercept communications and to use whatever technical powers they have at their disposal to read those communications. And in fact, constitutionally speaking, there is in this country no right to absolute privacy. The Fourth Amendment guarantees you the right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. By inference, then, it does not guarantee you to be immune to reasonable search and seizure, and that's how most courts have interpreted it. So basically what they're saying is, I have a set of technologies, I have rights granted to me in the Constitution, much as you have rights, and I want to be able to continue to exercise those. And they've been fairly successful in making that argument over the past. The other side of the coin is the national security community, primarily led by both the National Security Agency and the National Security Council. The National Security Agency is the electronic intelligence cryptanalysis group reporting in as part of the Department of Defense. The National Security Council is a staff of the President of the United States under the National Security Advisor, and it contains people who come from the various agencies and do a work group there. And 3 years ago, President Clinton gave the National Security Council the job of coming to a resolution on the issue of encryption policy, only because no other of the interested parties had any reason to follow what the NSC said. Nobody actually did, because the NSC didn't have any budgetary control or policy control or anything else over any of those agencies, so they were just generally ignored. The other intelligence agencies that do have an input is the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, and the National Reconnaissance Office. Those don't know all the acronyms, but which basically looks like the Abbott and Costello, who's on first. One of the problems that we really have, certainly from industry, is who's in charge. Because you can go and talk to each one of these agencies, and we've been doing this now for many years, and get entirely different stories about what's going to happen and what their ability to influence changes, etc. And it's actually been a little bit tough to figure out what's been going on. There are some things that have recently changed. So what I'm going to try to do now is go through law enforcement's requirements as they believe they exist. What law enforcement needs, they say, is timely access to plain text of communications. And in this they mean not to the signals themselves, but actually to the plain text. They need to, if they tap a phone line, then they need information to the voice communications. If they tap a fax line, they need to be able to fax. If they put a bug on somebody, they need to be able to hear the conversation. The timely to them, if you're not aware of how wiretap law works, wiretapping is almost exclusively used in real-time access cases. It's generally not granted to non-real-time access. In other words, it's been heavily used against organized crime, against terrorism, kidnapping, pedophiles, etc. It is not given out indiscriminately. So what the FBI says basically is in all of those there's a person at risk, there's someone at harm that we need to be able to operate on very quickly. So the fact that you're giving me a message which I can attempt to break over the next 2 or 3 or 10 years doesn't really help me very much. They also need increasingly more and more timely access to plain text of stored data. In particular, when they seize PCs, they're finding more and more of the data that they used to just get in the clear now encrypted and not having the keys to deal with that. In particular, that's happening in both terrorism and the money movements of organized crime and also pedophile cases. As an example, and we'll get into this a little bit more, The people who attempted to blow up the World Trade Center used PGP to communicate between themselves. PGP, if you don't know, is an excellent and for all intents and purposes unreadable cipher system. Yet they were able to read all the PGP messages because the Windows operating system had conveniently stored the passphrase in the swap file. So they would be perfectly happy with a solution like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to decrypt everything. Some other obvious, non-obvious things is that when they go to court, they have to prove that this worked, that they did it and it's true. In other words, the methodology must be disclosed in a court of law. The defense has the ability to ask how you got this information, and you have to tell them. And the methodology that you use has to be repeatable, verifiable, and demonstratable. In short, it has to be scientifically valid. And basically, one of their biggest problems is crime exists all over the place. They have to have something, a tool that they can give out to field agents and people in other cities and all of that. So I'll get into some slight differences here in a minute. Let's look at the national security community. For sort of obvious reasons, they don't actually publish what their requirements are. But they do have some ways of categorizing things which make it a little bit more obvious. They categorize intelligence gathering into 4 different types of gathering. The first is passive, and this is what you generally think of when you think of people who listen into the ether or coded messages and break them. And that's the sort of traditional view that we have of intelligence gathering. But that's only one type. Another type is something called cooperative intelligence. It's also known as Title 50 intercepts in this country. Title 50 U.S. Code basically gives the FBI the authority to wiretap foreign nationals and foreign embassies in the United States without a court order and pass that information on to the National Security Agency, which they, of course, do. So they get a lot of information that way. The other type is something called close access, and the best way to describe that is Tempest Technologies. If you know anything about Tempest, it's actually a fairly interesting set of things. There was a time when it was closely guarded secret, and then we fortunately made computers so complex that they send out so many emissions it's pretty hard to read what comes out of them anyway. But now we're actually making the PCs a lot cleaner, and so Tempest is back in. And there are some excellent papers. One of them was done by some people in Cambridge where they have a font that you can download and put on a PC, and the font is, the way the font is written, it resonates on frequencies that are more likely to be transmitted because of the resonance that it produces with the video card's frequency, so that it actually broadcasts a much stronger Tempest signal. And so what you can do is when you run this font, you can actually ship out information that's not what you're seeing on the screen. You see on the screen one thing, and then the system behind it is actually reading out something and modulating the font, such that you can be received at about 100 meters or so pretty easily. I actually saw an excellent demonstration of that. Then the last type is something called remote access, and this basically means installing monitoring devices. An excellent book is called Blind Man's Bluff, if you've not read it. It is about U.S. submarine operations during the Cold War, and among the more interesting things were putting telephone taps under undersea cables in Russian harbors. And that's what that means basically by remote monitoring. There are distinct differences between law enforcement and the national security requirements. First of all are the similarities and differences. The similarities is that they both would like to keep their activities secret from their target, obviously. Both of them have a requirement to have the information in relatively short time. Certainly law enforcement does, and for national security for anything but long-term strategic needs it for operational timeliness. They both are constrained on the total number of resources they have available to use. The FBI, of course, doesn't have infinite resources. Neither does the NSA relative to the targets that they have to look at. So they have to just pick and choose what to look at. They also have a lot less resources in terms of being able to make any sense out of the information that they actually collect. And they both have both of their targets, if you will, have a belief that there is a problem here. In other words, in both cases, the bad guy has some notion that they're possibly going to be attacked by either law enforcement or national security. Now, the differences are more interesting. One of the differences is the FBI, when required to go to court, has to reveal how it got the information. The NSA never goes to court, never has to prove how it got the information. They don't have to show their sources or methods. One of the things I'll talk about in a minute is the remarkable amount that the government amongst itself does not cooperate. And this is one of the problems and leads us to why we had crypto legislation in the first place. But in this particular case, I'll give you an example. In the early days of fax transmissions, NSA very quickly developed a technology for intercepting and demodulating faxes on the fly. And this was a very good thing considering most faxes were going across the water at the time. FBI, some 3 or 4 years later, developed the same technology and was prevented from using it by the National Security Agency. There was basically a big powwow that happened all the way up to the President's office, NSA not wanting to make it public that such a technology was possible. And if the FBI ever used it and it went out in court, it would be obvious that the government possessed such capability, and NSA believed it would lose some of its key intelligence gathering technology. So at that time, the FBI was actually blocked from using that technology. And there have been several other cases of similar levels of technology which have all fallen from law enforcement in favor of keeping them quiet in the national security interests. So when you talk to people like the FBI and you say, yeah, but you should be able to do this. I mean, NSA can do it, why can't you? And one of the answers could be, they won't let me. So that's sort of an interesting byproduct. The other is the definition of interest. There is a reasonable consensus on the law enforcement side among the countries about what things are bad. Terrorism's bad, kidnapping's bad, theft of large sums of money from banks is bad. So you can generally get cooperation on those issues. NSA is unlikely to go to a country and agree that that particular thing should be spied on within the country. There's not going to get the same level of cooperation. So it's an unlikely thing. Also, the FBI is rather specific and targeted because that's the way the law reads. They have to go to court to figure out what they're going to spy on. NSA, on the other hand, can look at anything outside U.S. soil or non-U.S. citizens abroad, which is a huge area, and it is probably not unreasonable to say that they collect almost every electronic emanation on Earth that doesn't leave from the United States or a known U.S. citizen. So the volume is immensely different. Also, the legal framework the FBI has to go to a federal judge to get a court order to do that. The FBI is somewhat hamstrung that way. NSA, of course, as long as they follow the laws about not intercepting communications from U.S. citizens, is free to do whatever they wish. Also, NSA's targets, foreign governments, really understand that NSA is out to look for them. Fortunately, back to the comment from William Webster, most bad guys are stupid. Most bad guys actually don't understand the level of sophistication that can be applied against them, whether that's the classic crook awards of people who write pulled up notices on the back of their deposit slips and things of that, to the modern day electronic equivalent is bad guys using cell phones, for example, which is probably a really stupid thing to do. If you don't know how cell phones operate, you should look at a manual sometime and find out how easy it is for the guy on the other end, the cell, to turn on your phone. So you can actually have an instant bugging device if court ordered. So there's a whole bunch of things that happen here, and obviously governments are a little bit more aware of it than people. I'll also talk a little bit about how intelligence operations work within most intelligence organizations. It's usually a 5-step process, basically, is the best way to think about it. You basically first have to figure out what it is you want to look at. What do you target? It's relatively straightforward. The next thing is actually to acquire the signals, acquisition. In terms of the National Security Agency, for example, that's done from either satellites or airplanes or taps they've put on underwater cables or you name it. But they do acquire all of that. The third one is a more interesting one. It's called selection. And if you have recorded all of these emanations on Earth, figuring out which ones to spend your time on becomes actually a daunting problem. And actually, as it turns out, selection is the most difficult part of the problem. And in particular, it's made difficult by modern technology. Go back. Once you've selected the signals, then you do the analysis on them. That may be cryptanalysis, it may be traffic analysis, it may be some other form of analytical work that goes on onto the signal and onto the information. When you get it all together, you then have to cross-correlate it because no particular piece of intelligence is usually valuable or trusted without being correlated with other such information. So there's a whole thing called synthesis at the end. Well, the interesting thing is that while we tend to focus on cryptanalysis for code breaking, for example, that is not the most difficult process. It is certainly difficult, but arguably the most difficult is selection, which is deciding what signals to look at in the first place, and frequently we miss those. A good example, when the former Soviet Union inadvertently, or on purpose, hard to know, shot down the KAL jetliner over Sakharov Island, 3 days later the U.S. played the transcripted voice transmissions from that Russian fighter to his control base, which, by the way, are encrypted. So the interesting thing, of course, is that we bothered to record that in the first place, but that was probably one which was not selected for analysis until after the event. Then you had to go back and find it and then select for analysis, because if we were doing that on the real time, we would have known exactly what was happening, probably could have prevented it. So those are some issues. Now, why bring this up? And I'll talk about all of this right after this one. Some odd things happen. There is not full cooperation between law enforcement entities amongst themselves. So I showed you that list of all of the various law enforcement entities. There are jurisdictional disagreements, like between the FBI and the Secret Service. Who should be doing this? Who should have the facility to do this? Who gets to be the expert? Who gets the money? There are certainly differing procedures and processes in place for how to do this, and basically a remarkable lack of cooperation amongst the various law enforcement parts of the community. And there's only minimal cooperation between law enforcement and national security. Two reasons. One is there is a legal constraints against it, posse comitatus, which prevents the Defense Department from being used in policing affairs. It's actually part of law, and it prevents them from essentially assisting the FBI very much. The other is the sources and methods problem. Is if NSA helps, then they may end up in court explaining their methods. So by and large, they don't do that. What all this basically boils down to are a couple of things. It is, from the law enforcement perspective, what they are saddled with now is this huge rising technology, very little technical expertise. They can't go anywhere else for it. I like to explain the differences between NSA and the FBI with a simple little way of doing it. If you go to NSA with a problem, they are by and large scientists and engineers, and their first instinct is to solve the problem. If you go to the FBI with a problem, they are by and large lawyers and accountants, and their first instinct is to make it illegal. And this really permeates both agencies, and it colors the way they do things. So, in the encryption debate, so you have NSA worries. So we go back to why couldn't I ship crypto out? The whole rest of the world's got it. That's not the argument. It's an incorrect argument. The argument they would make is, yeah, the whole world's got it, but it isn't ubiquitous by default. If a U.S. company introduces cryptography and can freely put it out there, since the U.S. companies constitute such a large share of the market, then Windows, to use an example, would contain cryptography. Our chips would contain cryptography. Netscape would contain strong cryptography. It would be everywhere. And by default, likely turned on, and everybody would use it. And the difference is, going back to NSA's point of view, is step 3. Selection becomes mathematically intractable. If everything is encrypted, even weakly, then they don't know what to spend their resources on in the first place. So for them, the correct tactic is to slow the spread, delay the spread as much as possible, the inevitability of widely default cryptography. That has been their guiding principle from day one. From the FBI's point of view, they don't have the technical expertise. They don't have any domestic controls whatsoever. They can't stop people from using it. So what they did is a backdoor, and they said, well, what we really want is literally a backdoor, key escrow. That would satisfy, we think, our aim, satisfy everybody's, I think, industry and the rest of the country disagreed with them on that, but that was at least their goal. And what they basically said is, I have no way of forcing you to get key escrow. So I'll use the two levers that I do have. One is I'll write it into government purchasing requirements so that when people buy stuff for the government, it has to have key escrow, therefore I'll create a market. And second is I'll make it a requirement for export. Therefore, if you want to sell things outside the country, it's got to have key escrow. And since Americans dominate the computer markets, therefore everything would have key escrow. That was the thought behind it. What got them into trouble with that is that NSA didn't like that, because key escrow doesn't help the national security people one bit at all, because who on earth, what other government can NSA come to get the keys so they can spy on them? It's not going to work. So basically, it started out as a separate effort. I got this. Well, I'll get back to this. More on the FBI. The FBI right now maintains 3 resource centers. This is how it has approached its problems. When it first began to get, in the early 60s actually, a lot of communications related things. I mean, I hate to say phones have been around for a long time, but really struck the FBI that bad guys were going to use them in the late 60s. They came up with a series of wiretapping laws which were passed. And they developed a wiretapping center, basically an expertise center. It's called the Engineering Research Facility, and it's at Quantico at the FBI Academy there. And that's where they develop the technologies and techniques, and they run telephone switches and all of that. And that they were doing just fine until somebody decided to run digital switches. Just a piece of, most people have some very odd ideas about what technology does. Does anybody know how long it takes to do a phone trace? Guesses? Come on, I need help. You've all seen the movie, right?
15 seconds is what they tend to say.
Yeah, I would say it's probably less than that. It's about whenever you can walk over to the terminal and ask that particular node what number it's dialed. I mean, the packet that's sent within the switching equipment. So, but the point is, the movies that keep him on the line, we'll find out where he is. I mean, that's all bogus. That no longer exists. That was back when we used rotary dials and analog equipment. That went away a long time ago. But what didn't go away was that now all the traffic's digital. And so when they go out there and they tap the line, they don't hear the things they used to hear. Instead, they're having to demodulate, a trunk circuit, which has got 60,000 different calls coming over, and they have no clue which call they're looking for. And U.S. law prevents them from listening to them till they find out. Can't do that. It's against the law. So they had an interesting problem. And what did I tell you about the FBI's solution to problems?
Make it illegal.
You make it illegal. Well, they did that. And that is called CALEA. And it is the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. And it went into effect last year. Or actually, late the year before. And what CALEA does is it requires every common carrier to equip himself, herself, with the ability for the FBI to come in with a court order surreptitiously and pipe that communications off.
Haven't they pushed back the implementation date because the FBI hasn't actually listed what the requirements are?
No, there's a... you can't buy equipment now without CALEA access built into it. I mean, it just doesn't exist.
But you don't have to have the backwards compatibility yet?
No, that is correct. And that's arguable because part of CALEA was money to help people do backwards compatibility, but they obviously grossly underestimated that, and there's people in court about the costs and things. But suffice it to say, for new stuff, it has to have a CALEA capability. And what CALEA does, by the way, if you don't know, is that you have a registered switch with them. And the FBI goes to a room in the engineering research facility, and they dial in the switch's number, and they dial in the number that they want to listen to, and then the FBI owns the switch for that circuit. That's how it works. So no one knows that they do that. Well, that's how they did that. Okay. Well, that was real well until the internet showed up, and then the internet produced. Yeah, go ahead.
And another question then about that infrastructure. Who's guarding that?
Well, that's a good question. Well, actually, theoretically, federal judges.
Okay, so they're doing logs.
No, but at least within the operations there, the way that the logs are done is subject to extensive review and analysis. And the independent party, you can judge for yourself as if it's independent enough, is the Department of Justice as opposed to the FBI, and there are some differences. And my belief is that they probably do this as best they can. It's tough. I think if there are misuses of it, it's not at that level. It's illegal targeting as opposed to the procedural stuff that happens in the first place. Anyway, the internet came along and gave them another problem, and this is the problem that we've been sort of addressing. Encryption, and they can't even trace where the packet comes from. I mean, they got tons of problems, and it's just getting worse. And so what did I say the FBI's response was, right? You make it illegal. Well, they sort of did that this time, only that part of the law isn't going to fly. What this is known as the CISA Act, which is a Cyberspace Electronic Security Act, and it is now pending before Congress. And basically it does two things, and most of them are good. It actually came in with three things. The first thing it did is it modified the Fourth Amendment for something called no-knock, which meant that the FBI would not have to knock on your door. They could surreptitiously enter and place a bug on your PC and leave. And that didn't go over very well, so that fell out of the law. And now what's left over is the FBI has set up a national technical center, which I'll explain later and why that exists. And they removed that slight little problem with discussing methods in court. And if they can reasonably prove that the method is generic and was developed, if you will, strategically without context to the case that is being involved, then they don't have to disclose the method in a court of law. The sources, yes, but the methods, no. And there are some reasons why that occurs. So let's look at this one single slide is most of the talk. Okay, but I'll answer. Yeah.
I have a question about the conflict of interest between the FBI. If they want to break into computers, they're also supposed to reveal vulnerabilities. Then when's their line when they should find a vulnerability
to industry
and
whoever? Yeah, very good, because the FBI maintains three technical centers: the Wiretap Center, the National NIPIC, the National Infrastructure Protection Center, which is supposed to be trying to fix those problems, right? And now this cyberspace, the Net Center, which is supposed to be exploiting those problems. This will be interesting, but there is that's part of what we'll talk about in just a minute, because that's actually the gist of this whole thing, which is how you go about doing that. One of the things I would point out just in preceding is it is unlikely that the FBI would actually be the people to spot the vulnerability. They don't know you guys are much better at it than they are. I mean, quite frankly, this is not what they do for a living. This is what you do for a living. And one of the problems they've got is they don't have the technical expertise. Let's look at national encryption policy, how it's existed. And I classified it into four categories, and I'll talk about each one. The first one is the Cold War. Encryption policy started shortly after the Second World War. Basically, when Harry Truman signed the NSA into law, they also signed something called the ITAR, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations. And there's a series of laws governing how information or articles can be exported from this country. There's due process of review. If you don't like what the government says, you can go in front of a judge, you can do all those things. But ITAR set aside two other classes of materials. One was something called dual use, which is stuff that is both military and civilian, and it has to be treated slightly differently. A good example of a dual use item is an airplane, military and civilian. So in that context, you can export an airplane if it doesn't have guns on it, for example. I mean, so it's treated a little differently. And then a second category material, which was considered inherently a munition by birth. Only two things existed on it: nuclear weapons and cryptography. Now, when this first came about, this was in the early 1950s. That made perfect sense. Only crypto boxes were very large. They were military things. They were generally painted sort of drab olive green, and they had funny connectors on them and handles, and they were carried around by military guys, and that was all they were ever used for. All that worked very well until the arrival of the PC and the internet, sort of the next phase. And then we had some very interesting things because everybody needed crypto now. And also, over time, basically, the real change came in 1976 with the Diffie-Hellman protocol published, when cryptography also became a legitimate academic discipline. When new advances in cryptography came out of the academic community, not out of the military. Very interesting. Cryptography is a collection of technologies, not just for secrecy, but for authentication, for signaturing, for you name it. All came out and were developed. It became obvious that everybody needed cryptography. Well, basically, what happened was the NSA relaxed a bunch of its procedures. Sure, you can export that, but only weak cryptography, only 40 bits. Or you can export that, but only if it's bound tightly to a medical system so that we know it's going to be used in a medical system. The way to read that is slow the spread of ubiquitous cryptography, and all cryptography that goes out there is something we can break. And they also put something else into effect at that time, which is probably the more daunting, which is something called the technical assistance rule. It is now currently illegal for you to export technical assistance about cryptography outside the United States. Technical assistance is any material knowledge for building, operating, or designing a cryptographic device or algorithm. That's technical assistance. So clearly source code falls into that. And that's why you can't export source code. It's considered technical assistance. It also means that you can't export just the paper description of an algorithm. You can't even have a conversation explaining that on a chalkboard. With some exceptions, one of them the First Amendment, which it sort of can't get in the way of. So if you publish it and it's covered by the First Amendment, then technical assistance doesn't apply. So what a lot of people do in the industry is you need an international standard which has a crypto algorithm in it. The first thing you do is you go get an ISBN number and you mail it to 10 different good libraries so that they have it in stock. Then it qualifies for the First Amendment. Then you can send it anywhere you want to. Funny game, but that's what's been played. So that existed for a while, but with the Cold War going around and industry, such as the computer industry and the telecommunications industry, making so much noise about how unfair this was and how ridiculous it was, NSA was basically getting beat over the head, and they were having not much effect in being able to hold the line. So they said, well, they went to the FBI and said, you have a problem, and you're not aware of it, and here's your problem. There's going to be lots of encrypted messages going around that you guys aren't going to be able to wiretap. They basically went over and they woke up the FBI. And they woke them up in a big way. The FBI went ballistic. And Louis Freeh was very successful in Congress and got the debate about encryption shifted from a national security debate to a law enforcement debate. And that had an entirely different set of things to it. You had congressmen and senators who were willing to stand up and say, the Cold War's over. Why are we doing this? But aren't willing to stand up and say, I support child pornography. I mean, it just doesn't work. So they were put in a pretty bad position. The FBI gained a lot of ground. Key escrow initiative among those came out. A number of other things. Remember the Clipper chip? That was spawned primarily because of this. In the end, I like to liken this to Frankenstein's monster, because in the end what happened is not what the NSA wanted, and they lost control of the encryption question entirely, and it belonged to the FBI. And the FBI went around proposing, among other things, key escrow models and other things which don't help NSA and don't deal with the problem from their perspective. And that existed up until about a year ago, at which point a number of things happened. One is many of the thrusts that the FBI were doing were shown to be technically infeasible or certainly not desirable. Key escrow was not very popular. A lot of backlash within the Congress about this. A number of other things happened. One was the Marsh report, which is about the vulnerability of the U.S. infrastructure to outside attacks, showing that cryptography was badly needed in that. The other was a DoD report which is fairly recent, that says the Department of Defense is required to buy U.S. products for mission-critical systems. It can't buy cryptography because U.S. companies don't make it. So that generated a change, and there is now a current change in cryptographic rulings as of about 3 weeks ago. And what this one basically says, the new rulings are going to be roughly about this. For retail products, those things that one could go to Fry's and buy, good way of thinking about it, you can ship any crypto, any key length, anywhere, except for the 7 terrorist countries, but essentially anywhere. Done. If you can buy it on a retail shelf, you can ship it. Hardware, software, it doesn't matter. 2 caveats. 1, NSA gets a one-time technical review. We've actually been doing that all along. It isn't onerous. It's basically a technical description of what the product does. They put it on a shelf. If they ever need to break it, they go dig it out so they at least know what it's got inside. For many products, the sales brochure is sufficient technical review. I mean, it's not onerous. They just want to know what algorithm you're running, basically. Gives them a heads up. And you have to report the first tier of exports, meaning if I send it over to Europe, I have to say at least who I sent it to. That's fine. I don't have to track it from there. So that's retail products. For non-retail products, those things which are not likely to be bought at Fry's, you can still ship any bit length, any crypto algorithm, except you will have to show that you didn't sell it to a foreign government. Now, this actually makes sense, because really what NSA is worried about, they're not worried about computers, quite frankly. They're worried about crypto chips ending up in cell phones. You know, that's not a retail product, right? That's a wholesale product. They want to know that that didn't go to a government. That didn't end up in a piece of military gear that goes on a battlefield somewhere that they will have a hard time breaking. That's really what they're trying to stop. In the heart of hearts, that's what I'm trying to fix, because I don't want to fight a war in Iraq and not be able to break the communications. Thank you very much. So that's sort of where this gets. The other things, though, that did survive are 2 notions. One is something called crypto with a hole. You still cannot export an application that doesn't actually have crypto in it, but merely makes calls to a cryptographic infrastructure without a license. And I'll explain what that rationale is in a minute, though I don't like it. We'll continue to fight that. That's at least an interesting one. And the other is technical assistance still exists. You cannot export technical assistance. So the way to read the new rules is NSA is back in charge. Has nothing to do with law enforcement, sorry. And that the rules are basically crypto everywhere, but it better be American. That's it. So we can ship anything we want. You can't ship something over there that is going to buckle to an arbitrary cryptographic piece, because they want that to be shown to be buckling to something made in the United States. That's basically how it goes. And they're going to make it as difficult as possible to foster cryptographic industries outside the United States, thus the technical assistance. Make it hard to share information in the scientific community and in the business community. And that's what's driving this. And from their perspective, it's at least approximately meeting their goals. So, as I said, more on this later, and we'll do that. I'm going to look at some technological trends. So I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly. But when I argue this point with governments, the main thing I argue about is that cryptography is not the only problem that they've got. And if they get stuck focusing on this, they're making serious errors. So there's a couple of obvious trends. One is the move from analog to digital. We all see that. We're in the midst of that industry. But it has some interesting repercussions. I'll give you a very good example that points it out. From my computer standpoint, bits are bits, regardless of how they came about. But it turns out most copyright laws make a distinction on where the bits came from that's left over from the analog world. So suppose that I have on my computer the bits that belong to the song from Titanic. I forget the name of it, but you all know what it is, okay? Now, depending on where that song came from, even though it's the same song, I have different rights. If the song came from a CD, I have the right to make one archival copy, according to copyright laws. If the song was from the movie Titanic as broadcast over the television, I have the right to copy that for time shifting, for viewing or listening at a later date. Then I need to destroy the copy. If it came from the DVD movie, I do not have the right to copy it. My PC doesn't know. So one of the real problems we've got is, I use an analogy, The internet, the web, we have reinvented the printing press. It is that fundamental in terms of copyright law on what we have. We've just totally changed the ballgame. We haven't come to grips with that. So anyways, trends from analog to digital have all sorts of other problems. One of them is, from a security standpoint, from a national security standpoint, bits are bits. I mean, unless you know what the format of it was, you don't know what it was. Unless you know it was an MPEG-3 movie, you may not be able to tell that that's an MPEG-3 movie. Unless you know that that's a voice conversation compressed with, pick one, then you may not be able to know that's a voice conversation. The other is something called Baud versus MIPS curve. Moore's law basically says that we're really making MIPS run real fast. We're getting faster and faster at a certain rate. Whatever that rate tends to be, there's also an increase in the amount of baud rate that we get going over time. But that baud rate is by nowhere as steep as the MIPS rate. So basically you get this diverging curves here. And what Intel, for example, spends a lot of money doing is figuring out how to match that bottom. We like to find things where you trade MIPS for increased baud. What are that things that comes down to is codecs, right? So compression algorithms, better and better compression algorithms, using more and more CPU cycles allow you to fit through thinner and thinner pipes. But what that does say, interesting from a security point, is that those compression algorithms, a really good compression algorithm removes all redundancy, right? It looks an awful lot like an encrypted message unless you know what the compression algorithm was behind it. And some of them are data-specific compression algorithms which keep like a Hoffman table and don't bother to send it because it's the same kind for every data piece like that. So you are really lost without knowing what it is. The other is very sophisticated digital signal processing to increase that bandwidth, meaning forward error correction, echo cancellation, and bilateral error negotiation. All things in modern modem protocols basically means something like this. Why did we jump from 28K modems to 56K modems? Anybody know? Because both modems speak at the same time. It was that simple. I mean, it's the same hardware inside, it's just a slightly different protocol. And what happens there is both modems speak at the same time, and the modem on one end subtracts its signal from what it hears. Thus, the only thing left is the signal from the other end. It's called echo cancellation. Okay? And that's why we get that speed. But the problem is, that's just simple physics. A third modem teed onto that does not know what either modem sent and can see only the anding of those signals. It is extremely difficult to demodulate. In fact, may get only a fifth of what goes through, making best guesses. The second is, those particular noise characteristics vary on a line over time. So there are many newer modem protocols that do bilateral negotiations. They do, if you will, a ping test very frequently, and they test for the characteristics of the noise and inform the other modem about what its thresholds are, and the other modem adapts, and they adapt. A third modem hanging on the line can't ask either one of those modems to take its characteristics into account, and it begins to lose information. So there's a whole bunch of things just in pure physics that are beginning to go on that make intercept a much more difficult problem. Instant-on computers. One of the problems with instant-on computers is that if the computer never goes down, if the computer never saves anything to disk, forensic evidence may be more difficult to get. It may be only in volatile storage at any given time. So it's a minor one, but it is there. Other things that we see that may or may not be good or bad, but you're seeing a lot of offloading to what we call digital tokens, whether they're smart cards or PCMCIA cards or things along those lines. And those things are unlikely to be left in place. They're very private, frequently locked up by passwords, is yet something different. It's a little bit more difficult to understand how to intercept or how to deal with those. Another trend, which I'll come back to, is digital certificates, but basically whether they're X.509 version 3 or something else, there's obviously a wide proliferation of digital certificates for electronic signatures. They can identify both people and machines. That's actually an interesting thing because it may actually make identity easier in cyberspace than it has been in non-cyberspace. So from a law enforcement perspective, that actually may be a plus, not a minus. Cryptography, this is just a simple little statement here to basically say, if Moore's law says that we're doubling computing power about every 18 months, if you add to that something called Metcalfe's law, which is talking about the value of a distributed system, of a network. In particular, what you basically, one way to think about it is the effective computing power that can be brought towards cryptanalysis doubles about every 12 months because you can involve the internet, not every 18 months. So one way to think of it in cryptographic terms is every year you lose a bit. Whatever key size you were using, it drops by a bit every year. So if you can break now a 56-bit cipher, which as was done with the last DES challenge in a matter of a day, less than 24 hours, how many bits would you need for the same technology to last you 30 years? Well, you can actually do the math. If you drop a bit a year, then that'll tell you what you need to go to. Other trends in terms of cryptography. Cryptography as a science is becoming extremely well understood. It's very well theoretically grounded, and if you look back in castles at the sort of fixed fortification days, nobody in his right mind builds a fixed fortification nowadays because that be bypassed and blown off. The balance that's gone up between cryptography and cryptanalysis has clearly tilted towards cryptographers, not cryptanalysts at this point in time. We have mathematical descriptions. We can understand how hard things are. We know the rules about how we build ciphers. I can build you an arbitrarily difficult cipher. I can make some statements about it mathematically, and I can decide how long I want you to be able to do it by brute force, and I can pretty much do that. So for all intents and purposes, the days, if you look at the World War II space, if you will, actually ciphers at that time favored the cryptanalyst because we didn't understand the ground rules very well. It's clearly shifted now, and it's entirely different. IPsec is definitely coming. We see it in a big way. It's going to have probably default encryption as part of it. The other one, which is a more interesting one, is steganography. Most people are sort of vaguely aware of steganography. Steganography attempts to hide the nature, the existence of the communications rather than than the contents of it. It's most commonly seen in terms of digital watermarking. If you look at the slide, that's an image that was computer generated, and I've actually, my photograph has been put into that image as a spread spectrum signal, and with no error correcting and everything else, and you can retrieve it. This is sort of typical watermarking technology. But from a bad guy's perspective, if we look at steganography, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, the good is we can do electronic watermarking to address illegal copying of intellectual property or negotiable instruments. I think you'll see electronic watermarking, digital watermarking mathematics being dumped into currency, for example, and other printed documents as well to help substantiate them. The bad is there's another rather interesting one. Steganography, because it hides the very existence of a communication, is probably much more valuable to crooks than cryptography is. And there is, for example, something called the steganographic file system, which was developed at Cambridge. And what it does is it looks like an encrypted file system, and if someone compels you to surrender its contents, you have two keys that you can give. One key gives the correct message, another key will render a cover message. And once given the cover message, it is mathematically impossible for you to argue that there's another message in there. So it gives plausible deniability, which is an interesting thing. So steganography, the ugly, really ugly to it, is that this is a brand new field. Steganography is now where cryptography was in the early 70s, and we're just now beginning to get our hands on it, and who knows where it'll go and what its technology may ultimately lead us in terms of interest to law enforcement or national security, or even what we can do with it in terms of products. There are also some, as I talked a little bit, hybrid documents that are a combination digital and traditional documents, watermarking electronic information in it. You can watermark printed documents. Xerox has an excellent thing where they actually jitter the font descriptions when they print it. They can embed information within literally the font as you read it. You can watermark sound images, stills, movies, almost anything. Obviously, there's a lot of biometrics coming along. Interestingly enough, the main driving force behind biometrics is not security, which I find rather interesting. I mean, people go out and sell them for security, but that's not what they're generally bought for. What you'll find is that people buy them because they're convenient, because all you got to do is walk up and slap your finger down on this thing, and it all opens up. You don't have to type in your password, and you don't have to remember, or you just walk up, it recognizes your face, and off it goes. That follows, if you will, Dave's first law, which is no one really wants to buy security. And so since they're buying ease of use, biometrics will probably take off. I do point out that people put a lot more stock in biometrics than they're probably capable of doing, since almost no biological trait is secret, therefore they can all be spoofed in one sense or another. So there's a bunch of other digital problems with interception, and we can go through all those, but basically the very last bullet there is the important one. If you decide that the best way to deal with all these technologies is to do what the FBI has traditionally done and simply regulate them out of the way, then you are stuck on regulating something out of the way every year. You get on a technology treadmill that you have to keep finding something. And if you look at it, that's exactly where they have been to this date. They had wiretapping laws at CALEA, they had the cyberspace law, they just bink, bink, bink. They're trying to deal with this legislatively. I think now they have realized that that's not a very good thing to do. And then if you look at the other things that are coming, what are you going to do? Outlaw forward error correcting modem protocols? I mean, because they're hard to tap? I mean, that doesn't make sense, because that's a very good technology which has a lot of uses. So basically, we all have to become a lot more savvy in security. I call it sort of a black chamber for everybody, because personal information is going to need cryptography, business information is going to need it. When bits have value, those bits are going to need to be cryptographically sealed. The black chamber, by the way, if you don't know, is sort of the history of cryptography prior to about 1915, 1916. So cryptography is basically an oncoming train. It's just math. It's a legitimate academic pursuit. Things are available worldwide. They're part of standards. So it's definitely coming. A very good talk a long time ago, I would love to credit whoever gave it, and I don't remember, but called Cryptography, the New Crossbow. Takes some explanation. During the Middle Ages, the status quo was maintained, if you will, by knights in armor and longbowmen. Those were the weapons of choice. Longbowmen were artisans and knights were very expensive. They were both employed by the status quo, the church and state at the time, and then some idiot invented a crossbow. And the crossbow is where your average farmer could take down a mounted knight. And the response of church and state at the time was to outlaw the crossbow. It seems very, very similar to what we have now. And technologically speaking, no piece of technology's ever just simply been outlawed away. It just doesn't work historically. So, conclusions that I can give. First is that information is becoming more and more difficult to intercept. Intercepted information is becoming more difficult to use. However, the origin and authenticity of information may be becoming more precise. So it's sort of a mixed bag. Last bit. I'll make the arguments that I have had is that cryptography is absolutely essential, so it's not going away. You can't control it. And national security and law enforcement communities have got to adapt if they're going to exist. And this is not so surprising. Security paradigms have always changed. They've always had to adapt. I have an interesting article from the New York Post some years ago, when there was a New York Post, with the chief of police of New York City complaining about telephones because he could no longer open the mail. So there has been a considerable change since that date as well. The other thing is that, to get to this, the end argument is not about profits versus lives, which is how it's typically portrayed by governments. It's really about making rational decisions about national security and those things. Here's basically how you're now seeing things fall out. No product is 100% secure. I gave the argument that it's just not even feasible to build a 100% secure product. Even if you could, it's unlikely that you can. So why not exploit the inherent vulnerabilities that exist? Basically, governments need to become the best hackers when so authorized. Right now, they're actually not the best. They actually lag far behind the rest of the community because they don't have the expertise. They don't work with that. Industry has continued to say, and I think we will all say, no back doors. We're not going to build you a back door. But what we will do is we'll give you all the information you need to exploit the things we know. But we're going to fix those as we go along. We'll tell you when we fix them. But because it's sort of 80-20 rule, we're never going to be able to fix them all. So there's a window there, and the best you can hope for is to exploit that window, along with the bad guys who are trying to exploit them. You just have to be better at it than they do. To that end, I just did the new expert roles. To that end, Law enforcement in this new bill has authorized a National Technical Center precisely to do that. And it includes industry and academic cooperation to help them get informed about where vulnerabilities are and what they might be able to make use of, and also to help vendors when they spot vulnerabilities that we don't know about to fix our products. From a national security point of view, they're going to expand slightly, if you will, the continuing education as part of the one-time technical review so that they can thoroughly understand what the products are that we're building and can figure out what vulnerabilities exist that they might be able to exploit. But again, I reiterate, industry is under no obligation to build in any backdoors. It doesn't satisfy anybody's needs. In fact, if you look at the critical infrastructure protection, it's counterproductive. So we're clearly not going to do that. But again, we can share information. I'll leave you with an example of how some vulnerabilities do exist. This is actually a lab example we did with PGP just to show you what I'm talking about. There's a tool we made, and basically the tool is a message voyeur in the Windows message cracking scheme. It's a message voyeur. It looks for PGP passphrase window to come up, and then when it comes up, it stores the keystrokes and sends them away to a bad disk sector that it marks as bad. What we did is we built an ActiveX component which had a Trojan horse, enticed some folks to download it from our website. This was all internal, mind you, so all lab exercise. And what it did is it FTP'd all stored items the next time they connected to the net. Off we got it. And actually it was pretty good. So we intercepted the PGP encrypted email messages on the server and the passphrases that went with them, the keys used. Very straightforward. This is a known vulnerability. It's a known vulnerability in the Windows operating system, for example. This amounts to, except for making sure that you get it deployed, a computer bug. It's exactly what the no-knock law was supposed to stop them from physically doing, right? Well, here's a way you can do it just using existing technology. Bad guys can do this as well as good guys. And using the right authorizations, the same mechanisms, court-ordered wiretaps, etc. This is a way to address the technical problem without trying to outlaw the technology, which clearly PGP has very good uses and in general is a very positive thing for society. So that sort of ends the talk, and I'll take questions if there are any.
Yeah. How, kind of a two-part question. How long till I can export crypto source, in your opinion, and you feel that these new weakened regulations, are they going to make that take longer or less time?
I'll answer the second one first. I think they're irrelevant.
Really?
Yeah, the new regulations, the notion about controlling source technical assistance has been strong, has been steady and continued. So the new laws are irrelevant to that. Now, when can you do it? It's certainly one of my hot items because I'll give you the worst example. There is a copy protection system running in the 1394, IEEE 1394 bus. It's called C5 standard or something. And Intel developed the protocols for that as part of the international standard. We didn't develop the cipher. Toshiba invented the cipher. And Toshiba took the cipher and got it exported from MIDI, which is who manages Japanese exports of cryptography, and sent it to us in the US. All we did literally was a cut and paste to put it into the document we were building, and we could not export the document back to Toshiba because of the crypto they had just sent us. Now obviously it makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, in no way can that be conceived reasonable or logical. However, it did exist. So there are many cases I run up against that which I find particularly annoying. To answer your question specifically, I think it may take 5 years. I would like to say shorter. The one thing that may change it is the Bernstein case. Now the Bernstein case, if you don't know about it, is a question of whether or not ultimately source code inherently is a work of art. It means, is it a work of expression? If it is, it's subject to the First Amendment rights all by itself. And any of us who have ever programmed really believe that it is a subject of expression, but it's sort of hard to get a court to understand that. To them it looks like a bunch of math. Well, it was argued in front of a federal court that this is a work of expression. It was the Sixth District, California. And the judge said no, it wasn't. It was appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals, who said yes, it was. And there are two options at that point. The government appeals it to the Supreme Court, which may or may not hear it. If the Supreme Court chooses not to hear it, then it stands. Right? So an off source code can be exported because it's a work of expression. Or their other tack was to ask for an en banc review. Now what that means is that you believe that this is so weird and complex that one judge sitting in the appeals court did not have enough knowledge to be able to do it. So you ask for a review of all of the judges of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's an en banc review, and they were just granted an en banc review last week on the Bernstein case. I don't know how long that takes, but my guess is 6 months, 8 months, something. But the interesting thing out of that is, in history, no en banc review has ever been re-reviewed by the Supreme Court. And why would the Supreme Court wish to overturn the entire 6 court judges? I mean, that would look pretty silly. So they generally don't even bother to hear it. But obviously the administration thought it had a better chance with an en banc review than they did with the Supreme Court. And so that's what they proposed. So who knows where that will go. Stay tuned. That will be interesting. And that's the best shot for quickening the technical assistance issue.
The recent exploit, I guess, was something that was found in the hole in Windows operating systems that supposedly NSA.
The NSA key.
And Microsoft subsequently denying that completely.
Yep.
Do you think that really was?
Well, I actually know what it was. Okay, and this is actually nothing mysterious. The way Microsoft operating system works, crypto CAPI works, is in order to plug, because they wanted to export the thing, they had to prove to NSA that the only crypto that could be loaded into CAPI had to be of U.S. origin, thus subjecting it to U.S. export constraints. The only way you can prove that is you have a digital signatory mechanism. So if you want to make crypto for CAPI under the current rules, not the new ones, but if you want to make crypto for CAPI, you have to send that crypto to Microsoft. They sign it, send it back to you, then you can distribute it, right? Then you can export it. Then when you try to plug it into CAPI, say in Germany, CAPI will check the signature and say, yeah, okay, that really did come from a U.S. corporation because I signed it back in Redmond. There you go. Piece of cake. Well, Microsoft has a big market share, and among the people who use Microsoft products is the National Security Agency. And in particular, they like to use CAPI, but they really didn't want to send their crypto to Microsoft for signature. And so they asked Microsoft if they would please embed an NSA key so that NSA could sign their own crypto without having to send it to Microsoft. Done. That was it. It's that simple. What Microsoft did do is they probably shouldn't have labeled that NSA key because that sort of created more trouble than it was worth. But it's been around for quite a while, and most of the community's known about it and known what it was for. I've been very involved in something called CDSA, which is another infrastructure, and NSA made the same request to us because we have a similar signatory mechanism, except that we do it differently. What we do is we license anybody to build their own CDSA and be their own signaturing authority. We don't want everybody sending us stuff. And all you have to do there is you just say, well, here's where you put in your key for the thing you build. And we give them source code. The difference is with CDSA, you get source code, you put in your own keys and build it. With Microsoft CAPI, they don't give you source, so the keys have to be dealt with. So from NSA's perspective, they were just dissatisfied. We gave them the source to CDSA that they use internally. They put their own keys in and done. But it solved the same problem. So I don't think there's anything sinister in that at all. It was just trying to sell to a customer. You know, if Union Carbide had been big enough, bought enough copies, I'm sure Microsoft would have put a Union Carbide key in there too if they wanted to. There's nothing sinister in that one. Not to say that there aren't other sinister things in there, but that one wasn't one. Anything else? There, yeah, I'll go over here.
I was reading an article in Information Security Magazine, just came out, the recent issue. They were commenting about the regulations for the heightened regulations of the fire that you were mentioning. And they said most of the regulations aren't going to, the actual description of the regulations aren't going to be out till December.
December 15th. That's
so
the target date.
Wait for the other shoe to drop. I mean,
there won't. I've been, well, two things. One is I've been asked to help write those regulations, so I'm not planning on dropping a shoe. And if there would be one, I'd be very surprised, because I've been assured that there aren't other shoes. And I think you would. One of the things is there's a loaded pistol sitting sort of off the side of the curtain, pointed at your head kind of thing, and it's called the Safe Bill. And there's a Safe Bill in the House and the Protect Act in the Senate. Both have gotten reasonable momentum. Happens to be that one of the Senate sponsors is John McCain. So he has a certain amount of punch at the moment. And so the administration does not want to please McCain. They would like very much not to have his bill go to the floor and win. That would not be seen very good. So they don't even want it to go there. I don't think there's going to be another shoe drop. This is very political, and it helps immensely that this is an election coming up. Absolutely. So I hope there's not another shoe. I don't think there is one. I think there's enough shoes just in the technical assistance and the CAPI issues that have to be worked out to not deserve any more to be dropped. And it's also consistent with what I think is their goals, which is, okay, if you tell me you have to have crypto everywhere and I have to buy it, then there better be American crypto everywhere that I can buy. So I think that's consistent.
I'm kind of wondering how technically advanced you think the NSA is. For instance, like if I, for some reason, didn't want to be detected by the NSA, didn't want them to find out what I was doing, would I be safe using the most current open source crypto software out there?
Okay, well, there's two answers to that question. First is NSA is prevented by law from looking at you, assuming you're a U.S. citizen. And they actually do pay attention to that. They wouldn't. So they're not who you have to worry about. And if you ask me the same question about the FBI, it has a different answer. So in terms of sophistication, you can do the math. I mean, we understand ciphers fairly well. You can easily use a cipher, which I'm sure that they're not going to break, assuming you handle keys correctly and you do all the other stuff right. I think it's relatively easy to not have them read your messages. Remember, most of what NSA gets has nothing to do with encryption anyway. And most of the emanations that are used for intelligence buildup are things like radar transmissions and microwave telemetry to satellites and all the other sort of stuff like that. They spend a lot of time looking at stuff that you're never going to worry about. I don't think you have much to worry about, quite frankly. If you're really paranoid, PGP is probably pretty good. There's an interesting definition I once heard of the definition between someone who's paranoid unreasonably and someone who's paranoid correctly. And a person who's paranoid in a reasonable way believes that they're all out to get you. And the unreasonable paranoid assumption is that they're all cooperating. And basically that's the only distinction. Yeah.
Question. I was reading an article too about one of the Intel chips, using Intel chips to create some sort of a, using the heat from the processors to...
Oh. For random?
Random.
Yeah, we actually, I've been meticulously trying to not be in salesman mode here, so I haven't really talked about us too much. But I will talk about that because I was actually intimately involved with it. Yeah, we do have a random number source. It's in a chip on the chipset called a firmware hub. And eventually it'll most likely be moved into the processor. And it is I can talk about it in great length if you want one-on-one, but basically it's thermal noise. And we believe it to be very good. We've done the best we could out of it, and it passes all the tests we're aware of. And we've shared designs with everybody who have an interest. If you think people have an interest in crypto, wait till you start moving random number generators around through governments. They show a keen interest in the design of that. If I were going to build a backdoor, that is where I would build a backdoor. It is not in other places. I would fudge the randomness so it isn't truly random, and then I would have a great time. So convincing people that you haven't done that is an interesting problem. And I spend a lot of time doing that, actually. But if you want to discuss that, not in this forum, I'd be happy to get that. We can probably get you samples if you're really interested. Yeah.
Okay, I got one more. I'm referring to securing the PC, moving things into the hardware and making instances unique.
Yeah.
Was that the idea behind making like unique identifiers and Intel processors?
Yeah, it was part one, and obviously we didn't do the best job we could have in that. I've done this before. I apologize if I'm running late, but I'll do this anyway. The best way to describe that is to use an analogy when Coca-Cola introduced New Coke, right? And everybody went, how could you possibly do that? That's dumb. You have a brand, and people started. And then they got rid of New Coke and they put in regular Coke, and their sales went way up. And so there was two schools of thought. And the first school said, you guys are really stupid. You didn't understand your brand enough, and you monkeyed with it and did this. And the other school said, you guys are devious. You did this on purpose, and your sales have gone up. And the best thing was the guy from CEO of Coke at the time said, well, we're not that stupid and we're not that smart. And that's how I sort of feel about the processor serial number, is that basically what it was is a trial, an engineering trial of trying to put uniqueness of any sort into a microprocessor. This is a difficult job when you stamp out 60 or so a second off the assembly line. Adding uniqueness is hard, and verifying it, doing all of that. So this was partially a trial to see if we could do things like that. Other uniquenesses that we might consider are things like public and private key pairs and things like that. I mean, that's a possibility of putting in. Interesting stuff. But first you have to figure out how to do it. And the serial number was actually a request from many, many IT organizations on give us something unique that we can help identify, if but only for asset tracking, the machines that I've got, or to help us with security, give us something we can get a handle on. So we said, okay, we'd try this. We tested it with lots of different audiences and groups, and everybody loved it, and obviously we didn't ask the right people because there were a lot of people who didn't. So we learned a lot. That's about all I can say on that one, and we will handle things differently in the future from that perspective, absolutely. Any others? Okay, thank you very much.